Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Graves from Court Accountability Action here with the Midas Touch Network and Legal AF. I am here today to talk with someone who is a real expert on the Federalist Society, which is the group of lawyers that was started in the early 1980s to create a pipeline to power for right-wing lawyers, for people who were described themselves as either libertarian or conservative. We're going to talk a little bit about the creation of the Federalist Society, what it's been up to, how it has affected the courts, including our rights, and get some ideas from our guest, Jonathan Riehl, who has been a reporter for Congressional Quarterly, who is interviewed in a new series called The Dark Money Game, and who wrote his dissertation on the Federalist Society. So, Jonathan, so glad to have you here. It's very nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit about what your sort of, I guess, not just your thesis, meaning your PhD thesis, but what your thesis is now in circa 2025 about what the Federalist Society is and what influence it has had on our rights?
Well, that's a good question because, it's been 10 plus years since my dissertation was completed. And I think I was kind of a little ahead of the curve at the time in terms of just the currency of that name and the fact that anybody would be talking about them outside of folks inside the Beltway who were lawyers and conservative lawyers. Where they were and where they're going are two very different questions. And part of what kind of reignited my interest after working on Alex Gibney's documentary was trying to get more of a handle on what has kind of happened to the group over the last 10 years since the Trump presidencies. Now, from its, it has a very interesting kind of origin story, and the reason I decided to look at them was essentially having worked as a reporter on Capitol Hill, but also having a legal background. It was a name and a group that I just kept hearing about, but I had very few people who could actually explain to me what it was, what they did, and who they were. And so I kind of set out to graduate school with that as my mission. And it was the unusual grad student who actually knew what I wanted to do when I got here. They began very kind of modestly as basically a student club of law students at a couple of Ivy League law schools. They didn't all know each other. Some of them were kind of more politically connected than others. Some were not at all. These were a bunch of pedigreed, legacy types. But they were extremely savvy. The growth that the organization had over the course of the 1980s, 1990s, and then into this century has just been phenomenal. And, I have a particular interest in social movement theory and teaching kind of about how communication operates as a way in which society can change, not just legally, but in general. Think about the way we talk, not just about law, but about society in general. And the Federalist Society always seemed to understand that. In particular, in their early days, they were mentored by a group of folks, some of whom went on to be household names like Justice Antonin Scalia, who was their first faculty sponsor at the University of Chicago.
Yep.
That was by happenstance. That was not by design. But those kinds of things happen, and they were able to through a combination of just good luck and good fortune and things like that, but also a real grit in kind of keeping themselves alive as a group after they graduated from law school. And most of them gravitated towards the Reagan administration in the 1980s. They just continued to grow and grow. And, what started off as a student group became a lawyers group, but they maintained that presence in the law schools, and they still do today.
Yep.
And so now they've got a massive organization that kind of covers all tiers of the legal profession, from the educational component to the practice component to the folks who work in government, and who are on the bench. So, from modest beginnings, great things have sprung. And the fact that, one of their vice presidents, Leonard Leo, was, flashed across, gatefold spreads in the New Yorker a couple of years ago during the first Trump administration, when he was passing his secret list of Supreme Court nominees to Donald Trump, made the Federalist Society, as a household name among those of us who track these things, was a complete shocker to me, because that, as I got to know these folks over the course of my years doing research, they're kind of a glorified debating society on par with something like the Oxford Union in the UK, but paired with a very politically savvy group of folks who were also part of the team. And, they were decentralized in a way that worked absolutely phenomenally for them, because, you have members of the Supreme Court who kind of grew up in the Federalist Society. But what interests me now, looking at what they've evolved into, is that when I wrapped up my work with them a decade ago, I never would have thought that this day would come, when they would become such a force that you'd have multiple sitting members of the Supreme Court, aside from Scalia, given his long ago connections to the founders, who are who are mentioned in the same breath as this organization. But to me, it's a study in the power of organization, real grassroots organization, paired with a remarkable ability of young people to promote themselves, promote their ideas, to form networks, and really build a social movement from the ground up that has gotten to the point now where we are seeing the fruits of the landscape of our constitutional rights being reshaped by many of the folks who came of age in the Federalist Society as law students, as law clerks, or as practicing lawyers.
It's so interesting to me, because I first encountered them in the late 1980s. I had a professor who was a fan of the Federalist Society. And when I started looking into it, it really struck me that it described itself as a libertarian and conservative organization in the early 1980s, when the main funder of the Libertarian Party was Charles Koch. And so, from the very early days, I think there's sort of an immaculate conception notion of the Federalist Society when, as you point out, they were immediately tied in with Antonin Scalia, who was soon to become a judge on the DC Circuit. They were tied in directly with Robert Bork, who had just become a judge on the DC Circuit. They were connected to the chief advisor to one of the richest men in the world, Richard Scaife, who had just received a memo about the importance of investing in universities, basically to create a pipeline for lawyers to have an impact on the courts and our law. And so they really came together at this moment at the beginning of the Reagan administration with, as you point out, as a student group, but with real heavy hitters backing them, including their first conference, which was directly targeted at Roe versus Wade. and trying to bring into the forefront this notion of so-called originalism, or this idea of that's the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution, that supposedly they were going to do what the founders wanted. And then if just to fast forward to the current moment in the most recent year, where you have 6 Republican appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court who in different ways have espoused some version of so-called originalism or original intent or textualism, or, what Leonard Leo is trying to now rebrand as structural constitutionalism. And yet these justices pave the way for unprecedented counter-constitutional immunity from criminal prosecution for a president, placing a president above the law in a way that's directly contrary to the language of the Constitution, which specifically says that the duty of a president is to faithfully execute the law, not break it, and certainly not violate criminal law. And yet we've had utter silence from the Federalist Society as an institution, and key leaders of the Federalist Society, including Leonard Leo, in response to this extraordinary decision that paved the way for Donald Trump's return, and in fact, in my view, emboldened him to, basically think of himself as king, or with king-like powers, that he cannot face any criminal charges for any of his so-called official acts. And so what do you make of, I'm not asking you to agree with everything I just said, Jonathan, but what do you make of this ideal that the Federalist Society claims it stands for, and the types of judges, at least at the Supreme Court level, who are now installed on the court, and how they have been remaking the law in ways that don't seem to me to be very originalist at all? I think our founding fathers would be shocked and horrified by that immunity decision.
Well, I mean, I think for one thing, it's always easy to kind of do post hoc, backwards-looking reasoning at where we are and where do we start, and of course we got here. My sense, as you said, about the Federalists always from the beginning have presenting themselves as a coalition-minded organization that was conservative and libertarian, was one of the things that struck me the strongest. Was that, and they will tell you this themselves, but I was careful as a journalist to make sure that I wasn't just repeating the party line. I got to tell you, years of basically being embedded with these guys at all levels, from the law school level to the national level, that I never discovered any such thing as a Federalist Society view. There were factions, and the libertarian faction was one of the loudest. And this is something I told Alex on a documentary, was that one of the things about overturning Roe that shocked me the most is that the divide within the organization that I found over that case was pronounced. Between the more social conservative side and the libertarian side, who didn't want government interfering with anything. And that included regulations, but it also included anything that goes on behind closed doors. Thank you very much. And those debates would get lively, and that didn't involve bringing anyone from any opposing organization in to represent the other side of a question, quote unquote. That was an internal tension that was on full display for anybody to see. And so, what interested me from the beginning was that the tensions that I kind of, the more I dug into the what went into the founding and the individual backgrounds of some of the people who set this thing up, was that it almost was a reflection of modern American conservatism in general, at least post-war, starting with the kind of William F. Buckley version of what led us to Reaganism after Nixonism, and that, on the one hand, you had Stephen Calabrese, who's a professor at Northwestern, but whose uncle had been dean of Yale Law, and does not agree with his nephew about very much, but would always show up at the conferences and say, "Now, Stephen, what are you telling him now?" And there was on, whether it was on Roe or on any number of other on executive authority, a very, very robust internal dissent among members, and I mean law students as well as the lawyer practice groups and the leadership. And so, what has where I have become interested again, in where the organization has gone with itself, really, over the last 10 years, or at least since Obama left office, is what's happened. Because I spent a lot of time with these folks at all levels, and I got to tell you, I never would have imagined in my wildest dreams that these were the types of folks who would want to chum around with Donald Trump. Now, I can't say that for Leonard Leo, because I've been quizzed about this by lots of folks from various media outlets. I probably interacted with him the least of any of the leadership of the organization. And my understanding was mostly that was because he was off freelancing and raising money. And that was Leonard's job. And the rest of us run the Federalist Society. And so I don't know. I mean, this is where like my knowledge kind of drops off at, where he fits into the current picture. And their leadership is going through a complete turnover now. Gene Meyer, who had been not quite the founding, president, but almost, and whose father was a colleague of Bill Buckley's way back when, he's departing the scene and somebody new is coming in. I don't know where Mr. Leo fits into that picture now. And I think it's also complicated. I mean, I've seen recently that one of his many dark money nonprofits had found a test case that was going to challenge, had identified a plaintiff in Florida who was going to challenge the legality of some of Trump's tariffs on constitutional grounds. And that now you might have a very ironic situation where, the fellow who was kind of made out to be the baddie because he had the list of folks who overturned Roe might be sitting on the opposite side of the table. I'm flustered and flummoxed by a lot of what I see and read currently, and I'm hoping to kind of revive my project, because I'd love to know what has happened to the organization since the advent of kind of the Trump takeover of the Republican Party, because it doesn't align with kind of what I felt like I came to know pretty well on any of these levels, executive authority, or the uniformity of viewpoints on something like right to privacy or not.
Yeah, I mean,
those tensions were there, and now I don't know. Are they gone? I don't know.
Well, I really appreciate your observations and views, Jonathan. It's fascinating to me. I mean, certainly there has been reporting about a divide between Stephen Galapresi and Leonard Leo as co-chairs of the board of the Federalist Society, in particular, I think, over that immunity decision, or the case as it was coming to the fore. But my sense is, as you describe it, that Leonard's role has been in fundraising, in raising money from his billionaire buddies. And I suspect that he's now one of the biggest funders of the Federalist Society, and so is probably exerting a lot of influence in his own way as he expands his empire.
He was almost infamous within the organization for perpetually taking these so-called leaves of absence, in which he would, I think he had two sets of business cards. One that didn't have Federalist Society on it, in which he'd go off and do his political work and his fundraising work. And then when he'd come back to the office, I guess he'd switch business cards. I'm not sure. But I spent a lot of time in their office on K Street. I mean, these folks opened their doors to me, let me have free reign on their archives. And I honestly think maybe I saw Leonard Leo in the hallways a handful of time over 4 or 5 years. He just wasn't around. And I assumed he was off.
It's just so interesting because when he sat for the documentary film with the Washington Post reporters, he claimed he had nothing to do with money. Money wasn't something he ever talked about because he was always an ideas guy, which is, quite different than,
That's not my observation. That's what I was told.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I don't know who told me that, but that was a uniform response I was given. Like Leonard knows politics, and he keeps us funded.
Yeah,
like,
I mean that's
conventions and have these meetings, and the money comes from somewhere.
Yeah,
it doesn't come from advertising, and not much of it comes from dues. Because a lot of the memberships are free, but it came from somewhere, and somebody was good at that. And that's but I in terms of the personality of the organization, if you can call it that, or persona, I didn't. Whatever my dissertation wound up being, 350 pages that didn't wind up getting published, but maybe will. He's in it very little, simply because he wasn't around. He wasn't at the conferences. He just wasn't there. Maybe that's the story. The dog that didn't bark. I don't know.
I so appreciate your coming on. I look forward to what you're going to be writing about or doing next, Jonathan. I actually have a book coming out called Without Precedent, which is about John Roberts, that includes some of the story of the Federalist Society from my perspective. But I would love to have you back on as you continue or take up new aspects of the Federalist Society based on your deep knowledge of their practices and history. And in the meantime, I hope that our viewers will subscribe and share and come back for more conversations with people like Jonathan about how we got here and perhaps where we're going. So thank you, Jonathan, so much for being on Legal AF with the Midas Touch Network. I'm Lisa Graves from Court Accountability Action, and it's been lovely to have this conversation with you.
Thanks a lot.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.